I'm Laura Dyer with the Capacity Building Center for Tribes, and I'm just here today to help with the technical pieces of the webinar. I know we have a couple of minutes until the start of the webinar, but while you're all getting settled in, I just wanted to share some tips. So this is Zoom that we're using today, and you can mute and unmute your line at any time during the webinar by clicking on the speaker icon that's on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. And you can also mute and unmute by hovering over your name in the participant list. For folks that are joining us that may be connected via telephone only and not on the webinar portion, your line is muted automatically, but you can unmute if you'd like to speak still by pressing *6 on your telephone keypad. You can turn your camera on and off at any time during the webinar by clicking the video icon on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And it's right next to that microphone icon, so please check to make sure your video is set to your preference. If you run into any issues with the audio and it's not clear, a telephone number was provided in the meeting registration email and can also be accessed here by clicking the small arrow next to the microphone icon, again on the bottom left of your screen, and you can select switch to telephone audio. Sometimes telephone audio is a little more reliable than the computer-based audio. The chat is open during the webinar today. If you click on the chat icon that's on the bottom bar of your screen, a chat box should pop open if you don't see it already. Please go ahead and use that chat box to say hello and introduce yourself now if you don't mind. If you send a message to everyone, we'll all be able to see it in the webinar room here. If you want to send a private chat to me, if you have any technical questions or need any support, I'll be there to help through that. And lastly, today's meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our website, the Tribal Information Exchange, and we'll be sending an email out with that recording as well. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleagues with the National Native Children's Trauma Center. Laura?
Hi, thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. And I just really wanted to thank you guys for your interest in today's webinar, the topic of trauma and building resiliency, and your time this afternoon. So we appreciate you all being here. I wanted to acknowledge the Center for Staff Leadership Team, or Center for Tribes Leadership Team, and I also wanted to acknowledge the Children's Bureau and their funding to make this webinar and this series possible. Please take a moment if I see a lot of you going already, but type into the chat box, let us know who you are, what tribe you're from, and the program you're representing today. That would be awesome for us. Today we're really going to be focusing on building a trauma lens, and specifically an Indigenous lens for child welfare work in tribal communities. We hope that as we collectively gain a deeper understanding of the impacts of trauma on individuals, families, and communities, that we're going to be better equipped to support those that we serve through our tribal child welfare programs and do this work in a trauma-informed way. There is quite a bit of content that we're going to move through today, so if you have any questions that you post in the chat box that for whatever reason we don't get to, know that Marilyn and myself from the National Native Children's Trauma Center will spend some time reviewing those and provide attendees a full response to any questions that weren't answered today. Awesome, we got lots of people chatting in where they're from. I appreciate that. It's great to see people from all over the place. Understanding the impacts of trauma and that significant role that resilience plays and the practice strategies that support people and agencies that have experienced trauma is an ever-growing topic, and by its very nature, really expansive. And at the Center for Tribes, we recognize this and have developed a few opportunities to learn, discuss, and strategize around practice implications for tribal child welfare program. And in these next two webinars, it's a two-part series that we have going on. What we really hope to do is create space for self-reflection around the ways trauma has influenced our own lives and how this influences our interactions with those we serve. We're hoping that we'll build some recognition skills for the symptoms of trauma in individuals, families, and communities, that we're going to understand the intersection between adaptive trauma responses and resiliency. We're going to explore some key protective factors that build resilience, and then really in that second webinar, spend some time strategizing around how to build up environmental protective factors that buffer kids, families, and our communities from the negative impacts of trauma. So my name is Laura Gay. I'm the one there on, let's see, it's my right. And I am the Training and Technical Assistance Manager for the National Native Children's Trauma Center. We're based out of the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana. My role at the trauma, my career history is really child welfare work. I have been doing child protection. I did child protection for about 10 years in a variety of capacities. And my time over the last 3 years at the Trauma Center has really been focused on how to support tribal programs and building systems that are trauma informed. So moving beyond kind of training people to be trauma informed, but looking at ways that systems and programs can embed trauma informed practices so that it doesn't come down to one person striving to be trauma informed, but that the whole system is there to support that trauma-informed person and carry on those services. And Marilyn, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you are. I am Marilyn Breuer Zimmerman, and I am an enrolled citizen of the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Sioux tribes reservation communities in the northeast corner of Montana. I'm also a Nawa and Anishinaabe descendant, and I'm the founding director of the Trauma Center, which was founded in 2007, but currently I serve as the senior director of policy and programs at the National Native Children's Trauma Center. And my work has focused early in my career on prevention, specifically suicide prevention, violence prevention, and in 2007, I came to the University of Montana to be the founding director and have been focusing on the impacts of exposure to violence, grief, and loss in American Indian children, youth, families, and communities. And Alaska Native families and communities. And that's the work that we've been doing. We always talk about how we started out training in evidence-based treatment models for trauma symptoms, but we quickly found that you couldn't embed a evidence-based treatment model within the context of a system that wasn't at least rudimentarily trauma informed. And so that's the work that we've been doing since about 2015. Thank you, and glad to see everyone here. I'm so excited to be here this afternoon.
Thank you, Marilyn, our fearless leader. All right. We like to start any presentation where we're discussing trauma with a disclaimer. Trauma impacts the majority of the population, and collective trauma is especially meaningful for tribal communities as a result of colonization and the violence perpetrated against so many relatives. And we want to say that if this content today is hitting home, if you find yourself struggling afterwards to manage the emotions that are coming up for you, that's okay, and it's normal. And know that there are supports out there in addition to the supports you all already have around you. So talk to your people, and if you need it, contact the 24/7 crisis lines whose numbers are listed above. Let's start with a working definition of trauma to create a common language for us as we move through today's webinar and the webinar on resilience in 2 weeks. Trauma is any event or set of circumstances that a person experiences that causes overwhelming terror or fear for their life or the life of a loved one. These events can be acute in that they're isolated and without pattern, like a car accident, stranger assault, a house fire. And they may be chronic, meaning a continued pattern of exposure over time, like neglect as a result of parental substance use, or it could be exposure to ongoing family violence or ongoing sexual abuse. Complex trauma, which is what most children and caregivers moving through the child welfare system have experienced, is when multiple chronic traumas occur in childhood and are perpetrated by a person who is in a caregiving role. That this complex trauma has profound effects on development and social emotional functioning. And I did also want to acknowledge that collective trauma experienced by a group of people, and for many American Indian, Alaska Native people, this is the atrocities experienced by at contact and that have continued through present day. And Marilyn will spend some time today talking about specifically about historical trauma. A key message within this definition is our experience right there at the beginning. Trauma is deeply personal, and events impact each of us differently. That's because we're unique and come with our own predispositions towards resilience. We come from different support systems and live in different communities who are able to respond in the face of individual trauma and community level crises in their own ways. At the Trauma Center and Center for Tribes, we really believe it's important to name trauma. Naming an experience puts us in a position to really start grappling with what to do about it and how to heal from it. One of the tools we believe is a starting place is using a trauma-informed approach to care. And I do want to acknowledge that trauma-informed care is a buzz phrase, and that buzzwords and phrases are often a band-aid for not addressing racism and discrimination for all targeted oppressed populations. But we hope that trauma-informed care can be a tool to begin asking how these very traumas influence the systems designed to support the most vulnerable people. And that we hope with an Indigenous trauma lens, the tribal communities are empowered to create their child welfare programs to be completely responsive to the needs of their communities, and that they can continue to dismantle those policies and protocols and services that have resulted and continue to support that discriminatory agenda. So what is a trauma-informed child welfare practice? It's one that realizes, recognizes, responds, and resists. And we're largely today going to be focusing on realizing and recognizing, and we'll touch on response going into that further within our second webinar on resilience. So the first assumption in a trauma-informed approach is that all people at all levels of the organization or system have a basic realization about trauma and understands how trauma can affect individuals, families, communities, and systems. People's experiences and behaviors are understood in the context of coping strategies that are designed to survive. There's an understanding that trauma plays a role in mental health and substance use disorders and should be systematically addressed in prevention efforts, treatment, and recovery settings. And similarly, there's a realization that trauma is not unique to the child welfare systems, that it exists across many child and family serving systems. I wanted to start today with taking a quick poll around the adverse childhood experience study and its impact. So I'm going to launch this poll, and if you would just answer with the answer that best represents your understanding, that would be awesome. You all can see that. So they're flying in. So. Keeping them coming in, and I'm just realizing you probably can't see them coming in. Only I can. So as I sit here in silence, watching them, I'm going to go ahead and publish it in the next kind of 5 seconds. So if you haven't, go ahead and enter in. All right. Okay, so it looks like about 61% of you have attended several trainings on adverse childhood experience studies and feel like you have a good understanding of it. About 28% have heard of ACEs but are not super confident in the results and how that pertains to child welfare. And a few of you have not heard of the ACE study. So I'm gonna stop sharing here and talk a little bit about that ACE study. We'll give kind of a broad overview here, but the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, or often referred to as the ACE study, started with Dr. Vincent Folletti, and he was the head of Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventative Medicine in San Diego, California. And he had an obesity clinic with a 50% dropout rate, And those dropouts, or the people who dropped out, were successfully losing weight. So he wanted to know why this was. We interviewed patients and found that the majority had experienced childhood sexual abuse, and that the findings suggested that the weight gain might have served as a coping mechanism and something that has kept them safe in the past. So in comes Robert Anda, and he is a researcher from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and they partnered to see if there was something to traumatic experiences in childhood having consequences in adulthood. It was a study that happened from 1995 to 96. They published in 97. They interviewed 17,000 adults in Southern California, and they asked 10 questions about their childhood. Each question was related to some type of adversity. So for example, did you live with a caregiver who had a mental illness? Did you experience sexual or physical abuse? Did one of your caregivers have a substance abuse problem? And if the answer was yes, they received a point. So answering yes to 5 questions equaled an adversity score of 5. And because they were asking adults questions about their childhood, they were able to review their current medical histories, which included information about their physical and emotional well-being. The major finding of the ACE study was just how much of an impact childhood adversity has on our health and well-being. Remember that those people being surveyed were adults at the time of the study, and those researchers were able to review their current health records. And what they found were strong links between exposure to adversity in childhood and well-being issues in adulthood. And some of those links are up here. So we're talking about alcoholism and drug use, smoking, depression, heart disease. It's a mixture of well-being and physical health related consequences. And the other thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship. So the higher the person's adversity score, the higher their relative risk for many of these undesired outcomes. But I do want to reinforce that childhood adversity does not mean a person will have diabetes or a substance use disorder. It simply means that risk is increased. And then I think perhaps one of the biggest surprises of the ACE study was just how common childhood trauma was. Of those 17,000 adults in the Kaiser Permanente system, so mind you, they were largely Caucasian population. It was largely middle class, well-insured people. 64%, or almost two-thirds of the people, had been exposed to at least one adversity in childhood, and 12.5% had experienced 4 or more. And why we highlight that 4 or more is because of that dose response and increased relative risk for some of those negative outcomes that we showed on the slide previously. There is not a lot of published data on ACEs specifically for American Indian and Alaska Native population, and that research that does exist shouldn't be generalized to all tribal people, as each tribe is unique in their culture and their geography, their history, and their access to resources. But there is, however, a consensus among Native American scholars that American Indian and Alaska Native people do experience higher rates of trauma than their Caucasian counterparts. I've highlighted 2 studies here. That middle column of numbers is a study that occurred across 7 different tribes, and then that last column that says South Dakota, it looked at all people identifying as American Indian or Alaska Native living in the state of South Dakota. And so what you will see is more people were reporting at least 1 ACE, and more than double were reporting 4 or more ACEs. And in showing you these studies, we hope it does 2 things. 1, emphasize how resilient American Indian and Alaska Native people are in their communities. And 2, create a picture as to why it's so important we are talking about trauma and resiliency, and what we can do with it, with the information and about it. The original ACE study only asked 10 questions about childhood. They did not focus on community and system level traumas that impacts kids and families, and especially children and families of color. And these larger community level forces are gaining a growing body of research to suggest they affect health and well-being negatively in the same way those original 10 adversities do. And I think it's important to acknowledge that what we're experiencing now amongst this pandemic will likely have effects for decades to come. Many of us are living in fear or worry about our health or the health of loved ones. We might be having a hard time concentrating. We might be isolating or not sleeping. And so this pandemic may be experienced for many people as trauma. And I just think that's an important piece to recognize given the current context that we're in. So here's a conversation piece. The ACE study began the Western conversation about trauma about 20 years ago, but tribes have been talking about trauma and resilience for much longer. And I think that's really important to acknowledge, but also acknowledge how important it is to understand trauma and resiliency in a place-based and a people-based manner. And that is helpful when we start thinking about strategic planning about what prevention services to invest in and what intervention services would be most helpful for the people and the community that we're serving in. So if people are willing, I have another poll here. And it's just asking if your tribe has teachings about trauma and or resiliency, and if those teachings, if you do have those teachings, are they really well known throughout the community? Are they only known by certain people in the community, or maybe we're not sure? And then the second piece to this is if people would be willing to chat in any of the teachings that they might be willing to share, or if they have a word for resilience or trauma in their native language. Give you guys a second to type in. I just really think it's important to look at what are the traditional teachings around trauma and resiliency, and that creates the jumping off point for how communities can respond, because they understand how it impacts the people there and how it impacts the community that they're in. Okay, I'll give you guys a couple more minutes. Got some good votes here. Share these with you all. Let's see, 10% of folks said yes, they have tribal teachings about them and they're well known throughout the community. About 40% said that they do, but not everyone knows what they are. And then quite a few folks are not sure about those teachings. I just think that that's a really good starting point if in your community you're having these conversations of, we know trauma impacts our community, but what does it look like here and what can we do about it here? So it's not kind of a universal strategy so much as it is really specific to the people and the place that you're in. Thank you guys for participating in that with me.
For some reason, I can't seem to send my chats.
Oh, shoot. I'm going to have Laura D connect with you.
Yes. Hey, Doug, I'll send you a message and see if you can respond to that. Thanks.
Okay, we have covered a lot, and talking about ACEs is challenging, right? We don't want to look at our adversities that we've experienced in childhood and think that that dictates our future. And it doesn't. It simply increases risk and is good information to know so that we can work on building each other up to be able to withstand some of these adversities that are happening. So we want to highlight that tribes and indigenous people are resilient. The fact that we are here today having this conversation is a demonstration of that. And remember that recovery from trauma is not only possible, but it really is probable. Marilyn is going, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Marilyn, who is going to spend a little bit of time talking specifically about historical trauma and its impacts.
Do we have a comment that we want to talk about first?
It's
Laura?
a great question. And I think there's just some comments about one of the biggest teachings in our community is that we are all Cheshish, which is, of course, using their language. And I don't know if Ann Fasthorse wants to tell us what that word is or those words are. And it's about survivors of the flood. It's printed in the back of our tribal IDs. Ann, did you want to just mention what that word was?
Good afternoon. This is Annie Fast Horse. The word is Chesheshwawelikson. And it's in our Lummi Chawson. That's our Lummi language. And it's on our building, it's on our IDs, it's everywhere because we teach the story of the Great Flood. That's how our tribe ended up here on our tribal lands.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, that is beautiful. Wonderful. So just very briefly, I want to discuss historical trauma. And I was reminded by a young colleague, Alicia Musso, who was blessed to be able to go to the Red Cloud School. So she learned her tribal history. And as we think about historical trauma, we have to really remind ourselves what it is that we lost. So just reminding ourselves that families, like in all societies for tribes, were the fabric of that tribal community, and the Native families sustained connectedness to tribal cultural practices that included ceremonies, spiritual practices, and family and community values. And that interconnectedness of tribal families and communities also included the interconnectedness to all creation. So historical trauma conversation begins with Europeans settling in North America and colonization practices or strategies that really devastated tribal families and communities. And so it's what is thought by most detrimental, though, to some of those assimilation policies to the well-being of the children and the family and the entire community is the boarding school experience, where generations of children were removed from their nurturing, loving, supporting families and communities. And instead of growing up as cherished members of wholesome families, they experienced the trauma of separation and endured maltreatment, neglect in the boarding school setting, and often returned home to their families and communities as strangers. Generations became adults who entered life without really a strong cultural identity and struggled often with finding their place in their families and communities. And as part of that struggle, many developed unhealthy coping strategies like substance use, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. Many have chronic suicidal thoughts, chronic health and mental health challenges, but most of all, a lack of knowledge about how to parent their children in a loving, nurturing environment. So that seems to be what is most detrimental. However, it has remained a theory, but Les Whitbeck, in this particular study that's on the slide, and his colleagues at the University of Iowa, wanted to really sort of try to quantify the historical trauma theory. And so they met with the tribal people, the elders, and some of the youth, and they asked them about what if they ever thought about the losses of land or language or culture. And they found that about almost 30% of American Indians in this study thought about the loss of language every single day. And 25% thought about the loss of their traditional ways every single day. 30% every single day think about the loss of their relatives to alcoholism. Almost 30% thought about the loss of respect by their children to the grandchildren and elders. But the other part of the conversation is, you think about that, you have these thoughts about them daily, but do they impact you emotionally? When you think about them, how does it make you feel? And so very often, and sometimes, they had always, often, sometimes, seldom, never. And there were feelings of sadness and depression sometimes, 44%, 38% had feelings of anger sometimes, 25% were impacted by a loss of concentration as they thought about all of those losses. And 22% avoided places or people that reminded them of those losses. So even though it's historic, these are historical events, they are continuing to plague our people today and have contemporary, modern day, everyday, today consequences. Laura, can you push the... So others had a study, and we can get those references for you all if you're interested. And they found one particular study found that individuals with substance dependence experience more distress related to historical losses than people who are not dependent on alcohol and drugs. And what's most important, I think, to this conversation is that people younger than 30 had similar historic trauma scores to those of people who are older than 30. So it's not just our elders and our older generations of people that are impacted by our history. It is indeed our children and our young people.
Thank you, Marilyn, for sharing that. So we just spent some time talking about realizing the widespread impact of trauma, and now we're going to talk a little bit about recognizing symptoms. So the next assumption in a trauma-informed approach is that people in the organization or system are able to recognize the signs of trauma. And these signs are within the children and families we provide for, but they're also in ourselves and our colleagues, and we can see them across the systems that we work within and refer people out to. Some of the key ways to build recognition we'll talk about throughout today is learning all that we can about how trauma impacts the brain and how it can disrupt development. And we're going to do some of that in just a few slides here. We're going to learn what it looks like across the lifespan, not only what it looks like for young children. And to increase recognition skills, we'll talk about implementing screening tools that support the identification of trauma histories while also identifying those unique factors that are protective for that child and family in front of us. So let's start with an overview of the brain and body's response to trauma. When a child's who's been impacted by trauma perceives danger, their brain quickly organizes and activates resources for the body to use to act on that stress. So the brain tells the body to energize itself and release more oxygen, release hormones, get ready. It makes the body as efficient as possible tackling stress by shutting down any non-survival related parts or processes. So things like digestion and higher order thinking slow, and the limbic system takes precedent, which is the more reactive and emotional part of our brains. And it helps the child to act out quickly to protect themselves. If the danger goes away, the body calms down and goes back to normal operations. But if the stress continues and is pervasive, a person experiences what we call toxic stress. And that is like the saber-toothed tiger that entered the room earlier, left the room, but is still lurking around the house. The body slows down to conserve energy and allows the brain to relax a little and engage in more complex thinking, but not fully. And during this state, there's just really little room for learning new information or building relationship. A person remains in a high alert mode is constantly scanning for danger or any change that may be seen as a possible threat. And when they're operating under that stress response system, it just doesn't take much to trigger a full-blown stress reaction. So what are those responses to trauma? There are three primary responses. Hypervigilance, that looks like jumpiness, nervousness, being quick to startle. It's a need to constantly scan the environment and other people for danger. I've heard it described as constantly being on the balls of your feet. And as a result, a person who is hypervigilant could experience sleep problems, have higher levels of anxiety. Their heart rates beat faster, more per minute than their counterparts. Their respirations are higher. They may appear impulsive or reactionary. Avoidance and numbing means that a person feels just that numb, frozen, shut down, separated from their normal life. They may pull away from friends and activities that they were once part of. And sometimes youth withdraw to avoid any reminders of the traumatic event that's happened to them. Re-experiencing or reenactment, that's when thoughts, images, sounds, or feelings associated with the traumatic event come back into our minds uncontrollably. They may come back in dreams or nightmares. And it's these images or sensations that can be so intense we feel as though we're going through the trauma all over again. Young children may also re-experience or reenact traumatic events through their play. They may try in their play to make whatever happened to them turn out differently. They may try to rewrite their story through their play. Something that many of the children, caregivers, and relatives in the child welfare system experience are trauma reminders or trauma triggers. A trauma reminder is something in the environment that reminds a person of the trauma they've experienced. They're most often received through the senses and emotions. So when individuals are triggered, they feel suddenly scared or threatened, and they often have no idea why. Sensory triggers include the five senses, right? So sights, sounds, taste, touch. Persons who experience verbal abuse may be triggered by a loud voice or an upset facial expression. People who have suffered physical abuse may be triggered by a person's fast movements. And positive attention or physical touch may be a trigger for someone who has sexual abuse as part of their story. Triggers can also occur through emotions. So that feeling of rejection may be a trauma reminder for a person who in childhood was neglected. Feeling vulnerable may be a trigger for a person who's been emotionally abused. And when a person is triggered, they typically respond by fighting, fleeing, or freezing. If they have a fight response, they may engage in conflict or become physically aggressive. If they flee, we may see them isolate from others, run away. And if their response is to freeze, they may become withdrawn, refuse to do things, become clingy or tearful. And we talk about this because we unintentionally trigger the fight, flight, freeze response in others all the time. What is insignificant to a person who has not experienced ongoing trauma, something as simple as a pat on the back or hollering to get a person's attention, can be very threatening to the person who has that trauma history. If you yourself have experienced trauma like many of us have, you likely have something that triggers you back to that moment. It could be a song that comes on the radio. It could be physical touch. The point is, it's important for us to know the histories of our clients so we can avoid triggering them, but to also know our own triggers so that we can be prepared to regulate them and regulate ourselves when they inevitably pop up. So I have another poll for you all, and it's just asking if we know what our triggers are. We often can talk about how we see the trauma response in many of the kids and caregivers that we work with. But I think sometimes we miss the conversation of, well, what does it look like for me, right? We know that trauma is common, so that many of the people in helping professions or any profession have experienced trauma. But do we know what that looks like when we're triggered? So I'll give you all a couple minutes here to answer this, and I appreciate you getting vulnerable with me here. I know it's not easy to talk about. Okay, a couple more seconds here. Got a couple more filing in. So yes, a lot of people, 62% have spent time trying to understand what their triggers are personally. A third of folks know they have them, but haven't spent that time identifying what they are. And a few people are saying this isn't something I've considered yet. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and what we can do as we move forward. So I appreciate that. And I would really challenge you all to spend some time of thinking about what your experiences have been and what are kind of some of those moments you find yourself becoming dysregulated and what that looks like and maybe what might have set that off. All right. So this isn't an exhausted list of symptoms, but it does cover many of the most common symptoms that exist as a result of a child or an adult experiencing toxic stress and existing in a world where triggers are all around them. And I also wanted to highlight that these symptoms are not a given. Our experiences are unique. So some people can experience a traumatic event and not have any of these symptoms present in their life in a way that negatively impacts them. So we see infants and young children having delayed physical development and struggles with attachment. This is often the result of caregivers who are not able to be attentive or nurturing for whatever reasons those are. We gain muscles in our body by turning our heads to look at our doting caregivers, and our brains learn that there is reward for engaging in relationship when our parents are sitting with us and giving us love eyes all the time. And if this doesn't exist, it can create a gap in that development. As youth get older, you might see defiance, aggression, or despondent behaviors. These are learned and have served to keep a child safe in the past. So remember that when that foster parent calls you and says that the child won't come out of their room, or that they threw their their plate of food across the room at dinner, ask yourself, what could that function of that behavior be? Are they keeping adults at a distance the only way they know how? And are they doing that because the message they have received up until this point is that adults aren't safe? And because our brains develop from the bottom up, from the most basic functions to the most complex, adults who experience trauma in early life may struggle with executive functioning skills like planning, remembering details, problem solving, making decisions. And they may have relationships in their life that aren't healthy but reflect what they know. They may use maladaptive coping strategies to try to numb or forget what's happened to them in their lives. But just like young kids, these behaviors are learned and have been learned as the body's way to protect itself from the physical and emotional pain they found overwhelming. So we often hear language in child welfare about compliance, and it's often connected with value, right? So it's good when a parent is being compliant with their case plan, and it's a risk when they're non-compliant and providing their weekly drug test. A trauma lens will ask us to recognize that a person is not as simple as compliant or not compliant, and they're often under extreme stress with trauma histories influencing their reactions and their abilities. A caregiver who's experienced sexual abuse as a child and has a child in care because of repeated exposure to perpetrators is likely existing in a completely triggered state, experiencing feelings of shame from what happened to them has now happened to their child and they were unable to protect, and that they now have to work with the very agency they feel never protected them when they were young. So existing in a more continuous cycle of fight, flight, or freeze is going to make it very difficult for this caregiver to track information, and certainly if it's things like dates, times, and locations. So, and they almost always will have a hard time remembering if that information is only told to them once in one particular mode to deliver it, like over the phone. And all this to say, it just can't be boiled down to simply saying a person is or is not something. We are complicated creatures, and trauma makes it challenging for people to plan ahead, to track information, to be willing to trust people when they need help with something, to be vulnerable in new relationships, and to problem solve logistical issues. So not surprisingly, individuals with trauma histories are often reluctant to engage with or quickly drop out of services because of their past experiences. So examples of how this may look is not being willing to provide information, having confusion or poor memory over details, personally attacking the folks that they're needing to work with, like their caseworker or their behavioral health support people. In general, having hostility towards the agency and being reluctant to discuss problems with people, or on the flip side of that, demanding that others solve their problems for them and do it right now. And I also wanted to highlight that there's trauma that exists within the services, the serving systems that exist for vulnerable children and families. So when we think about removals where a caregiver doesn't know where their kid is going or when they're going to see them next, that is most likely going to be experienced as trauma. Going to court and not knowing what may happen or even the purpose of the hearing, that may be experienced as trauma. When promises are made and not kept about visitation schedules or reunification dates, those can all be really triggering and traumatic events. So these are just some of the individual symptoms we see people experience. And Marilyn's going to talk with us a little bit of some of the symptoms we see within the family unit and then within tribal communities. So I'm going to transfer over and look through this chat box here real quick. All you, Marilyn.
All me? Okay, I thought, all right. So again, as we think about the assimilation policies that were inflicted on Native people since contact, we have to understand, and we do know that there is the breakdown of the traditional parenting practices. There's been a breakdown of traditional family roles, and intergenerational trauma has become cyclical, with generations of children and parents responding to their trauma with anxiety and stress, toxic stress responses. And what, of course, is, again, reminding ourselves as child welfare workers that separation of the family from the child through child welfare or incarceration, or needing to leave the reservation or needing to leave the community in order to seek employment, can have, continues to have a devastating impact on our tribal families. Next slide. So this particular slide I like, because it really is talking and thinking about what the parent is going through, who may have either in danger of having their child removed or has had the child removed. And most often in our tribal communities, we realize that children are most often removed because of substance use disorders that the caregivers are struggling with. And so as the parents begin to step into recovery, they are going to need a lot of supports. And we have to have a really deep understanding, not just of their trauma, but understanding that there is some remorse and guilt and shame about their neglect or their behaviors, maybe even abusive behaviors while they were using. They may have their own traumatic memories that they basically interacted with their children. Many of our families have, caregivers have a lack exposure to good parenting models and often engage in coercive or punitive parenting. And so in order to learn new parenting skills and more nurturing ways of being while they're in recovery and if they have a trauma histories, is going to take a lot of support of those parents, more than I think than we realize as we engage in working with and engaging tribal families. So we really do have to look at parent or caregivers' trauma histories as they impact their ability to regulate their own emotions. We always know that a dysregulated adult cannot help regulate a child or soothe a child. And so helping those caregivers really understand their trauma triggers and their trauma responses will help them be able to better manage as we think about reunification, or we think about prevention and preventing that child from being removed. There's also this notion that while they were using, or that they have made some poor decisions about their own safety or the safety of their children, right? So they may have put themselves in very unsafe situations. For women, they may have put themselves in situations where they experience either partnership violence or sexual assault, or they may have allowed their children to go with an unsafe adult. And now they have to, again, deal with that shame and guilt that they were unable to make those kinds of sort of really healthy decisions on behalf of their children. Next slide. So again, what are the symptoms of trauma in tribal communities? It's a loss of culture, language, and traditions. We continue to struggle with high levels of poverty, high unemployment rates, and we always want to be able to think about poverty not as a crime or a sin, but understanding that poverty really doesn't just deplete the financial resources of a caregiver, but also struggling with poverty really does deplete our caregivers' social and emotional and spiritual resources, and it can be very challenging. And then also knowing in our tribal communities that the infrastructure just often is not there. There's inadequate funding for family serving systems, whether that's healthcare or schools or mental or behavioral health and housing. Next slide. So all of that history, right, that we talk about doesn't just have its consequences in our own personal trauma or our community trauma. We start to think about even those service providers as we're doing our work. Many of us get into this work because we have our own trauma histories. And unless we're very aware of our triggers and what our histories are, and are working very hard to mitigate that for ourselves, we can engage in these unhelpful behaviors in a workplace that aren't helpful for our colleagues and definitely aren't helpful for the clients that we serve. So the term lateral violence comes out of the nursing profession, but it has been now associated with tribal communities as maybe an outgrowth or outcropping of children being removed and put in Indian industrial boarding schools. And one resource that I want to point out that I think Laura has put on the chat is from the Native American Rights Fund, is the Trigger Points, Current State of Research on History, Impacts, and Healing related to the United States Indian Industrial and Boarding School Policy. It's a good read. It talks about the impacts of what that boarding school did in helping in creating an atmosphere where children, even within, were pitted against one another for the scarce resources, the scarce food or warmth or care that was provided. We know that some tribes were pitted against one another, genders, even within the context of family members. Darker Indians did not fare as well as lighter skinned Indians. And so we come back to our communities without having had any way of protecting ourselves from being removed. So we begin to blame one another, and it's perpetuated today. And I love this definition that lateral violence occurs when oppressed groups or individuals internalize those feelings of anger and manifest their feelings through behaviors such as gossip, jealousy, or put downs or blaming. Next slide. So this particular list comes from a young woman who does a lot of work around lateral violence in Aboriginal communities in Canada. Her name is Denise. I forgot to get the name. Anyway, so Laura Dyer is going to put up the YouTube links for you all to view her YouTube videos. They're very informative. So she lists these symptoms as the preoccupation with who is doing what to whom, right? It's that sort of gossiping that we experience in our communities. She talks about it as an inability to transcend the role of a victim or abuser, and we don't stay in those roles. We change those roles depending on the circumstances and the people that we're with. It's when marginalized individuals don't feel trust or have their needs met, don't feel that they have a voice, don't feel like they can be heard. And she talks about it as the internalized oppressor that lives within us, which I thought was really fascinating. Another comment is about admiring the problem. I know very often we can be in public meetings in our tribal communities, and our tribal leaders sometimes, or our elders, will start talking about the problem, about how many suicides, how are the needs that we have, instead of trying to focus on the solutions and talking about what that could look like. Definitely, again, high levels of complaining, gossip, and really just not being able to ask for what you need. There's also this idea of revenge behaviors. sabotaging people, building alliances against a colleague, gossiping about a colleague, shunning a colleague. Those are all symptoms of lateral violence or relatives in tribal communities. Next slide. So individuals can be impacted, again, by experiencing lateral violence in the workplace or in the community. And we have sleep problems, changes in our appetite, decreased self-confidence, obviously, feelings of worthlessness, forgetfulness, chronic anxiety, and absenteeism from work as we don't feel appreciated or cared about in the workplace. Next slide. So what do we do about it, right? We know it exists. We've all experienced it. We all have, I mean, some of the tribes talk about the crab in the bucket, right? We've got that example. Every time you try to crawl out, the other crabs pull you back into the boiling water. No, you shouldn't be doing better than anybody else. But so what do we do about that? And how does it impact in our workplace? How does it impact us as individuals and our agency? And how does it impact how we can support the children and the families that we are working with? So a big part of the conversation is how do we create or build a positive atmosphere? Really being overt about acknowledging what's going well with individuals and as at a group, what's working. But also being able to recognize the behaviors or the language around blame or attitudes that show contempt. And then strategizing, how do we reduce these toxins? How do I help my colleague feel heard? They may be blaming or acting this stonewalling me because they're not feeling heard. How do I help them feel heard? And developing our own self-awareness and our own need to reflect about how we do this, how we're doing this work and how we are engaging in those unhelpful behaviors in the workplace and change our own responses. We have an opportunity to become offended. And we can either become offended or not offended. And sometimes it's just a choice about how we will respond, not just externally, but internally. And then there's this idea about addressing the issues directly. Oh my gosh, isn't that a unique idea to just say, no, that won't work. Or letting a colleague know that, that it won't work for you. You don't have to have emotions behind it. I know in correcting my children as when they were growing up, if I was interested in their development and their well-being, and I was at moments, I could correct them in a loving, nurturing way. But if they triggered something in me and made me angry, I wasn't quite as thoughtful and helpful to them, right? And we do that with colleagues too. We get triggered, and so we're reactionary, and we react in a way that's not helpful. So how are we going to address this in our workplace? We really do have to carry our power consciously, and it is contextual. I always like to remind folks that even if we're tribal members working for a child welfare agency in our own community, and we may even be going to our own sister's house to do an investigation, that we carry that sort of power of a child welfare worker, and to be very cognizant of it, and to just know that it can be very triggering for a family who's in danger of losing custody, or of a father who, is in danger of having his rights revoked. We have to understand that we carry that power and walk in a very empathetic, compassionate, thoughtful way. Developing role flexibility. Just because I'm a natural leader doesn't mean I have to lead in every circumstance. I'm not the only one that has to talk. I'm not the only one that has to make the decisions. That you have got to be able to lay down some of your rigidity around your own role and be very, very flexible. And then again, that ability to be able to respond to triggering and being able to recognize what the triggers are, and then developing those strategies that are going to help you be able to manage when you're triggered, and so you can self-regulate and calm. That will go a long way in addressing lateral violence in the community and in the workplace. Next slide. Oh, good.
Thank you, Marilyn. So Marilyn just spoke to one of the ways that we can respond to symptoms of trauma that are presenting. But what does response in a child welfare system mean? What are those? How do we respond in a trauma-informed approach? So a trauma-informed approach is one where the program, organization, or system integrates an understanding that the experience of traumatic events impacts everyone involved. So whether that's direct or indirect, it doesn't matter, impacts us all. Staff in every part of the organization, from the person who greets the family walking through the door to the executives and governance board, that they've changed their language and their behaviors and policies to take into considerations the experiences of trauma among the kids and the adult users of the services and among the staff providing the services. It can be accomplished through staff training, as long as that staff training has a budget to support ongoing training. It could be policies of the organization like mission statements or value statements, handbooks and manuals that promote culture based on the belief that resilience, recovery, and healing from trauma are real. The organization is also committed to providing a physically and psychologically safe environment for children, families, and staff. If you are interested, here's my plug. If you're interested in diving deeper into these response strategies, what can we do with this information we have about trauma? Consider joining our peer group on trauma and resiliency, where we're going to really be taking a deeper look into how to structure an Indigenous response to the trauma experienced by the families that we're working for. And that's going to be led by myself and my colleague at the Trauma Center, Lisa Stark. So I think we're going to throw up a registration link in the chat box. I see it there. So we do have more opportunities to talk about this in depth coming up through the Center for Tribes if you all are interested. So what are some ways that we can respond that's trauma informed? One of the most crucial things we can do to support the well-being of others is to do our own healing. And that might seem counterintuitive when the needs of our clients and communities are so great, but we risk our longevity in being able to provide support to others. We risk the quality of services that we offer, and ultimately we risk contributing to the systemic barriers that exist if we lose the energy to be constantly striving towards higher levels of practice. So the very first step in becoming trauma informed is to create space and set an intention to self-reflect on how trauma has impacted our own lives, our own families, and make sure that we're working towards healing from that. Make sure we know what our own triggers are and how we tend to react when we're overwhelmed, and focusing on a holistic approach to self-care. And then not only thinking about what would be great for self-care, but putting it into practice and prioritizing it as part of our lives. I have another poll for you. We do have a resource list on the Tribal Information Exchange specifically on self-care strategies. So I will let you guys know that to check it out. But we're just going to do quickly here and talk about what self-care practices you might utilize. So if you should be able to check as many of these as you want. You will know that it's not an exhaustive list. So if other is one of your responses, go ahead and, or you're not seeing yours up there, chat in the chat box what other self-care strategies that are your go-tos. Give folks a couple minutes here to respond. One of the things when we talk about self-care is just really that holistic approach. So how do we care for ourselves, our whole selves, instead of just what comes naturally to us? So some people are really spiritual, so taking care of that spiritual self-care is simple, but we struggle with taking care of our physical bodies, and exercise and traditional good nutrition is maybe not our go-to thing. And that holistic approach would ask you not to neglect even those parts that don't come most naturally to you. Okay, so we got some Zumba folks, singing, reading, walking on the beach. That sounds amazing. Couple reading in the poll here, and show you guys what we have. So quarter of you practice smudging, basket making. Exercise is a big one. That's Awesome, 62% of you. Some quilters, some drummers, beading, traditional nutrition. It's looking like the most reported one is connecting with friends and families, fueling your social side, right? That need for connection and that need to have people that we can trust and go to, but also people that trust and come to us. That reciprocal component is so important. Ceremony, and quite a few of you had others that you're listing here on the board. Awesome. Thank you guys for doing that with me. Tend to our garden, planted chili, corn, and different melons. Wow, my garden's just starting to pop up. It's a late start for me this season, but I'm starting to see the actual fruit to my labor. Riding a Harley, wow. Okay. The next piece I'll talk about here is affect management. And you'll notice that these first two trauma-informed strategies are things that we can control ourselves as individuals. The second strategy is about managing our own affect or our emotions. So people who have experienced trauma often have difficulty managing emotions, and we need to be centered ourselves so that we can be emotional containers for them. Feelings are best understood through processing and sharing with others in a reflective way. And to do this, there certainly needs to be an environment that supports it, which means a safe and regulated adult to confide in. For most of us, the problem isn't about having consistent or constant regulations. For most of us, we have a certain set of specific triggers that challenge our ability to regulate in the moment. And another reason why it's so important to prioritize our own healing is that so we have these regulation skills and can be those emotional containers for others. We can't support others who are dysregulated, as Marilyn said, if we ourselves are dysregulated. And this skill set, this regulation skill set, will allow us to depersonalize behaviors and say this hostility may be in front of me, but it's not about me. This is about frustration with a system. It's about what I represent to the person and how they feel their family's being threatened. And when we think about it, it's almost more worrisome when a parent isn't reactionary towards us. By the very nature of them reacting, they're telling us and their children that they're willing to go to battle for them. So because it's so important, we need a repertoire of tools we can access to help bring ourselves back to calm when we become triggered, which is inevitable, right? There are those triggers in the environment all over, so it's almost impossible to avoid them. We need breathing exercises that can help us before we knock on doors. We need to practice smudging or whatever our cleansing traditions are that we can do after a hard court hearing or a challenging conversation. We need grounding exercises to do in the moment when someone is upset and confronting us about decisions that have been made. And then we also need those long-term self-care strategies that fuel us for the long haul. And a lot of you guys in that last poll touched on some of those that you do, as well as in the chat box. So I appreciate you all sharing that. Another strategy we can employ both as individuals and collectively as programs is to create a safe environment for the families and the professionals working in and around the system. So a few ways we might do that are to meet a person where they're at and meet them in a way that they can understand. It's best practice to provide information in multiple ways. So is it verbal? Is it written? Is it repeated often? And is it done so in a way that they can understand? We want to be clear and to the point, simple. If we need to slow down, make sure we take the time to slow down. Consider the physical space of our environment. So is it a place that is calm and soothing? Do we have fluorescent lights blaring down on people, or do we have soft lighting? What kind of music plays in the lobby? Is it music that reflects the culture of the people walking through the doors? Is it calming? We want to minimize distractions and loud sounds, right? So the idea is that the less stimulus a person has to interpret, the less likely they will be to be triggered by something unintentionally. So creating kind of minimization of distractions within our building. Do they have access to basic needs when they come to the office or have to go to a place to meet with us? So do they have access to a restroom? Is there food and water and the supplies they might need to take care of their babies, like diaper material or formula? And then as professionals in the office that clients are coming to, are we regulated and kind in our interactions? So those are some suggestions that we can take on both as individuals. We can regulate ourselves. We can make sure people know where to access some of those basic need things. And also as programs, we might consider what are some changes we might make to the physical environment to promote both physical safety, but also that psychological safety. And then we're going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed screening and assessment. It's a really crucial component to any system where trauma may be the experience of the clients. It helps in screening tools help the professional serving the family be able to identify trauma histories, identify past reactions to those events or circumstances, identify the triggers that might exist as a result, and coping strategies that they have used, so both healthy and those that are not. And also, not just screening for trauma, but screening for what are those protective factors that exist within that family that can be built upon. And it's not quite as simple as finding a tool that works for the families in your community. More often than not, right? We work with tribes to adapt tools that exist to better match the needs of the people that they would be used for in the communities that they're in. But it goes beyond making those adaptations for the community. And it's really, we encourage you to use these tools as active components of the case plan or treatment plan. So sharing them confidentially with providers who also need the information aligns everyone around the family to work towards common goals and understand why a client might have some of the trauma symptoms that they do. So we really need to start to heal the roots and focus less on treating the manifestation of trauma. So we often focus on the symptoms of trauma and we miss the forest, the trees, if you will, when we're not looking at those hurts that are so deeply rooted within some of the families that we serve. I've got a quick poll here just to see if you all are using any sort of trauma screener. They look, there's many of them out there. They all look like different things. We certainly always advocate for them to be ones that look at both trauma history so we can avoid the obvious triggers, but also looking at what protects the kids and the families that we're working with and how we might use those to further buffer them from some of the impacts of trauma. So is a screening tool for trauma and resiliency something your tribal child welfare program uses or would consider? Results are coming in here. Thank you for doing this and sticking with us for the long haul here. Couple more seconds. So let's see. About 13% screen children for their trauma histories, 16% adults, 23 screen for both. That's awesome. Always important to remember that you know, we're working for the family, right? And that family unit is made up of the children and the caregivers. And about half of you are saying that it's not a practice we currently do. And we hear that a lot. And we really look at it as one of the simple kind of low cost things that can really support family reunification and can really support the well-being of the children and the caregivers as individuals as well. Okay, I've got one last screening tool question here, and it just gets to that second point of if we have if you use a screening tool, so those of you who said you did, does your program use it to influence the case planning? Or is it a form that gets filled out and isn't often used or revisited? Give you guys a couple seconds there. Okay, so looks like there are quite a few people who gets filled out and filed away. Yeah, that happens, right? There's a lot of paperwork involved in child welfare, and so figuring out how do you create kind of living, breathing documents that support families is super crucial. We use it as a living document. That's awesome. About 40%, and about 40% of you said somewhere in between. Sure. Right. So this again is one of those things we're going to dive deeper into in those peer groups if that's where the interest lies. So if you have interest in talking about trauma screenings or things that we can do in our practice to be trauma informed, that peer group will be an awesome opportunity to do so on a smaller scale and with your peers. Okay. That kind of concludes today. I'm hoping that for those of you who are still with me, you'll all take a moment. We have talked about some hard stuff. We have talked about some personal stuff. And I just want to give us an opportunity to, if this brought some things up for us, to bring ourselves back to kind of a regulated a place. So if you all wouldn't mind doing this with me, just we'll do it quickly. Just feel your feet on the ground wherever you are. Feel your sit wherever you are seated. Go ahead and close your eyes. And take a couple of deep breaths with me if you wouldn't mind. We just really appreciate you guys being here today and your interest in talking about this, even when the topic is so personal and is so challenging and might seem overwhelming around what we do with the information and where do we go from here. So in 2 weeks, my colleagues, Lauren Kelso and Lisa Stark at the Trauma Center and part of the Center for Tribes, will be facilitating a second webinar looking into specifically strategies to build resilience for youth, caregivers, and communities. So if you haven't, please register for that webinar. There's going to be a lot more time in that webinar to discuss and strategize practices that communities are using and that they're seeing work. If you want more information on trauma-informed strategies for child welfare programs, coming soon to the TIE is a resource list on trauma and resiliency. We also have that self-care strategies resource list up there. You can consider registering for the peer group that we talked about. And of course, if your tribe is interested in a specific tailored project within your child welfare program, reach out to us. There's a few different ways you can reach us. Our phone number is listed up there, our email, and of course, you can reach out to any of the center staff directly. And so with that, I think I will open it up for questions or comments. We appreciate y'all sticking with us and spending your afternoon here, and hope it was helpful. Laura's putting up there a link for you all to take for feedback. Those really help us kind of understand how we can improve these and make them engaging and useful for your practice. How do we access the PowerPoint and recording? I'm going to let Laura Dyer answer that. We will make the PowerPoint available. I know that. I have it saved as a PDF and ready to go out in an email. And the recording.
Hi everyone, this is Laura Dyer. I will be sending within the next half hour an email that just has the webinar survey link I shared there, a PDF of the slides, and then links to a number of the resources, webinars, peer groups that were all mentioned today. So you will all have that in your email in just a bit.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Anne. I'll leave this the room open for a bit if anyone has questions or comments, but otherwise, thank you again for attending. We are always just so grateful to see the interest and the willingness to have these conversations. So appreciate it, and we'll stick around for a little bit for folks that have questions, but if not, till next time.